I stepped off the Greyhound bus, my legs stiff from the long ride. Cedar Falls, Montana looked exactly like I'd pictured it. A single main street lined with weathered buildings that had seen better days, surrounded by rolling hills and mountains in the distance. The bus wheezed behind me as I grabbed my duffel bag from the luggage compartment. "You said you're headed to the Lee place?" the bus driver asked, coming up beside me. "Yeah, that's right," I said, slinging my bag over my shoulder. "Do you know how to get there?" The driver, Richard Evans according to his name tag, nodded and pointed down the street. "See that general store with the green awning? Wait there. Grayson usually comes into town around noon to pick up supplies. He can give you a ride out." I thanked him and walked toward the store, taking in the quiet town. A few locals glanced my way. A city boy was probably easy to spot. The general store had a wooden bench out front where I dropped my bag and sat down to wait. 30 minutes passed slowly. I scrolled through my phone, but the reception was spotty at best. Just as I was considering asking someone inside the store for more specific directions, a rusty pickup truck pulled up to the curb. The man behind the wheel looked to be in his 60s, with deep lines etched into his face and calloused hands gripping the steering wheel. He stared at me through the passenger window, eyes narrowed. "You Mickey?" he called out, not bothering to get out of the truck. I nodded and grabbed my bag. "Mr. Lee?" He didn't answer, just jerked his head toward the passenger seat. I took the hint and climbed in. "Thanks for the ride," I said as I buckled up. Grayson grunted in response and pulled away from the curb. He didn't seem interested in small talk, so I kept quiet and watched the town disappear behind us. The drive took about 40 minutes, mostly on winding dirt roads that led deeper into pine-covered hills. The truck bounced over ruts and potholes, making conversation impossible, even if Grayson had been inclined to talk. Finally, we turned onto a long driveway that led to a sprawling ranch. The main house was a 2-story structure that had clearly been standing for decades, with a large barn about 100 yards away and various outbuildings scattered across the property. "This is it," Grayson said, pulling up in front of the house. It was the first thing he'd said since picking me up. I climbed out of the truck, taking in my surroundings. The place felt isolated, cut off from the world by the surrounding hills. No neighbors in sight, just wilderness stretching out in all directions. "I'll show you where you'll be staying," Grayson said, leading me around the main house to a small cabin tucked behind it. The cabin was basic but livable. A single room with a bed, small kitchenette, bathroom, and a desk by the window. Grayson stood in the doorway while I set my bag down on the bed. "Job's simple enough," he said. "Maintain the fences, feed the chickens, collect eggs, keep an eye on things. I've got business in town most days, so you'll be here alone." "Sounds straightforward," I said. Grayson reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "There are rules," he said, handing it to me. "Follow them exactly." I unfolded the paper and read the list. 1. Do not approach the barn after sunset. 2. Collect eggs daily and smash any extras beyond 12. 3. Never touch the scarecrow in the north field. 4. If you see a dog, go inside immediately. There is no dog on this property. 5. Stay away from the south fence completely. I looked up from the paper, confused. Smash extra eggs? And what do you mean, there's no dog? Grayson's expression didn't change. Just what it says. Follow the rules, all of them, without exception. Break any of them and you're fired on the spot. No second chances. I wanted to ask more questions. The rules seemed bizarre, but something in Grayson's stern expression made me hold my tongue. Maybe this was some kind of test for new employees, or maybe he was just eccentric. Either way, the job paid well, and I only needed to stick it out for a few weeks. "I understand," I said, folding the paper and putting it in my pocket. "I'll follow the rules." Grayson nodded, seemingly satisfied with my response. "Good. I'll be back to check on you in a few days. There's food in the fridge and more in the pantry." As he turned to leave, I considered asking him to explain the strange rules, but decided against it. If this was how he wanted to run his ranch, I could play along. The rules were odd, but following them seemed easy enough. I'd comply without further questions and collect my paycheck at the end. I woke up to a rooster crowing somewhere outside my cabin. The sound pulled me from a deep sleep, and for a moment, I forgot where I was. Then it all came back. The bus ride to Cedar Falls, meeting the stern-faced Grayson Lee and those 5 strange rules he'd given me. I sat up in bed, rubbing my eyes. The morning light streamed through the cabin's small window. I'd slept with Grayson's list of rules on the nightstand beside me, as if keeping them close might help me remember them better. After a quick breakfast from the supplies in the cabin, I decided to explore the property. Grayson had mentioned my duties included feeding chickens and collecting eggs, so finding the chicken coop seemed like a good place to start. The morning air felt crisp as I stepped outside. The main house stood quiet, with no sign of Grayson. I walked around the property, taking in my surroundings in the daylight. Behind the house, I found what I was looking for. A modest chicken coop with a small fenced yard where several hens pecked at the ground. I counted 11 hens in total, most of them brown with a few white ones mixed in. They barely noticed me as I approached. Inside the coop, I found 8 eggs nestled in the straw. I carefully collected them in a basket I found hanging on a nail by the door. With the eggs safely gathered, I decided to check out the barn. It stood about 100 yards from the main house, a large, weathered structure with peeling red paint. In the daylight, it looked ordinary enough, just an old barn on a Montana ranch. I pushed open one of the big doors and peered inside. Farm equipment lined one wall, tools I couldn't name but recognized as agricultural implements. A tractor sat in one corner, covered in dust. Stalls lined the other side, though they appeared empty. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, yet I remembered Grayson's first rule: no approaching the barn after sunset. I wondered what changed after dark. I closed the barn door and continued my exploration. As I walked toward the north side of the property, I spotted it. The scarecrow Grayson had mentioned in Rule 3. It stood in the middle of an empty field, arms outstretched on its wooden cross. Even from a distance, something about it made me uneasy. Its burlap head tilted at an angle that seemed unnatural, as if it were watching me. The worn flannel shirt and tattered jeans hanging from its frame fluttered slightly in the breeze. I remembered Grayson's warning not to touch it and kept my distance, making a mental note to give it a wide berth during my stay. As I turned back toward the cabin, I noticed a small grove of aspen trees to the south. Through their slender trunks, I caught a glimpse of what had to be the south fence, the one Grayson had specifically told me to avoid completely. I thought about getting a closer look, but remembered Rule 5. Whatever was beyond that fence, Grayson didn't want me anywhere near it. I turned away and headed back to the cabin, deciding that some rules were better followed than tested. I spent the rest of the day organizing my small living space and familiarizing myself with the property. As the sun began to set, I made sure to be safely inside the cabin, remembering the first rule about the barn. Night fell, and I tried to sleep. Around midnight, I woke to sounds coming from the direction of the barn. At first, I thought I might be dreaming, but as I became more alert, the noises grew clearer, a deep, resonant lowing that didn't sound like any cattle I'd ever heard. It was more like screaming, human-like, but not quite. The sound made the hair on my arms stand up. I sat up in bed, listening. The noise came again, a long, drawn-out moan that rose to something like a scream before fading. I thought about going to check it out, but remembered Grayson's warning. The first rule suddenly made a lot more sense. Whatever was making those sounds, I didn't want to see it. I barely slept that night. The strange noises continued off and on until dawn, when they finally stopped. I got up feeling groggy and on edge. Later that day, Grayson showed up in his truck. He looked me over with those suspicious eyes of his. "Everything going all right?" he asked, his voice gruff. "Yeah, mostly," I said. "But there were some strange noises coming from the barn last night." Grayson's expression darkened. "That's why I gave you the rules," he said. "Remember the first one? No approaching the barn after sunset," I recited. "That's right," he nodded. "And you'd do well to keep following it." He didn't offer any explanation about what might be causing the sounds, and I didn't push for one. Something in his tone told me not to ask. After checking that I had everything I needed, he left again, driving back down the dirt road toward town. The next 2 days passed without incident. I fed the chickens, collected eggs, usually 8 or 9 each day, and kept well away from both the scarecrow and the south fence. At night, the noises from the barn continued, but I stayed in my cabin, trying to block them out. On the 4th day, I went to collect eggs, as usual. When I reached into the nesting boxes, I was surprised to find more eggs than normal. I counted them twice to be sure, 15 in total. According to Grayson's second rule, I was supposed to destroy any eggs beyond 12, which meant I needed to get rid of 3. I took all the eggs outside. Setting aside 12 in my basket, I held one of the extras in my hand, feeling its weight. It seemed heavier than it should be. Following Grayson's instructions, I smashed it against the coop's outer wall. Instead of yellow yolk and clear whites, a black substance oozed out. It seemed to move on its own, writhing like it was alive. I dropped the shell in shock and stepped back. The black stuff seeped into the dirt and disappeared, as if the ground had absorbed it. With growing unease, I broke the other 2 extra eggs. The same thing happened. Black moving substance instead of normal egg contents, quickly dissolving into the ground and vanishing. I stood there, staring at where the black stuff had disappeared, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I spent the next morning trying to make sense of what I'd seen when I broke those eggs. The black stuff had to be some kind of mold or bacteria. Maybe a chicken disease I'd never heard of. I'd grown up in Chicago after all. What did I know about raising chickens? There had to be a logical explanation. I scrubbed my hands repeatedly in the cabin's small bathroom sink, even though I hadn't actually touched any of the black substance. Something about watching it seep into the ground made my skin crawl. I made a mental note to ask Grayson about it when he came back, though I wasn't sure he'd give me a straight answer. That night, the barn noises started up again. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, or maybe some local wildlife that had found its way inside. But deep down, I knew better. The sounds weren't like anything I'd heard before. Low, guttural moans that sometimes rose to something close to screams. Not animal screams either. They sounded almost human. I pulled the thin blanket over my head and tried to sleep. It didn't work. The next day passed uneventfully. I collected 9 eggs, all normal looking, and fed the chickens. I walked the property line but stayed well away from both the Northfield scarecrow and the south fence. The barn looked completely ordinary in daylight, making the night sounds seem even more bizarre. Night fell, and with it came the noises again. This time they were louder, more insistent. I could hear what sounded like heavy objects being dragged across the floor, followed by that same terrible moaning. Around midnight, I heard something new. Footsteps on the barn roof. Heavy ones, like something big was up there, pacing back and forth. I got up and looked out the window but couldn't see anything in the darkness. The footsteps continued for nearly an hour before stopping abruptly. The next night was the same, and the night after that. Each time the noises seemed to get louder, more deliberate. I started sleeping with a pillow over my head, which helped a little but not enough. By the 6th day, I was exhausted from lack of sleep. On the morning of the 7th day, I noticed a section of fence near the main house needed repair. A few posts had come loose, probably from wind. I found some tools in a shed and set to work, grateful for the distraction. I was hammering a post back into place when I saw movement from the corner of my eye. A German shepherd trotted around the side of the main house, looking at me with friendly interest. Its tongue lolled out as it approached, tail wagging. My first instinct was to reach out and pet it. I'd always liked dogs, and this one seemed friendly enough. I even started to extend my hand. Then I remembered Grayson's fourth rule: go inside immediately if I saw a dog, because there was no dog on the property. I froze, my hand still partially outstretched. The dog tilted its head, looking at me with what seemed like confusion. It took another step toward me, still wagging its tail. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off it. The dog whined softly, as if hurt by my rejection. I kept backing up until I reached the path to my cabin, then turned and walked quickly toward it. I could hear the dog's paws on the dirt behind me, following at a distance. When I reached the cabin, I went inside and shut the door firmly behind me. Through the window, I saw the dog sitting about 20 feet away, watching the cabin. It whined again, scratching at the ground with one paw. For about 10 minutes, it just sat there, occasionally whimpering. I almost started to doubt myself. Maybe Grayson had gotten a dog recently and forgotten to tell me. Maybe the rule was outdated. Then everything changed. The dog stood up and began circling the cabin, its movements becoming more agitated. The friendly demeanor vanished as it started growling, a deep rumbling sound that seemed too big to come from its chest. It approached the door and began scratching at it, leaving deep gouges in the wood that no normal dog could make. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. The scratching continued, moving from the door to the windows. I could see its face pressed against the glass, mouth open in what looked like a snarl. That's when I noticed its teeth. They weren't normal dog teeth. They were too numerous, too sharp, arranged in multiple rows like a shark's mouth. And its eyes had changed too, glowing yellow in the fading daylight. I pulled the curtains shut and retreated to the far corner of the cabin. The creature, I couldn't think of it as a dog anymore, circled the cabin for hours, sometimes scratching at the walls, sometimes just growling. The sounds it made grew less and less dog-like as darkness fell completely. I sat on my bed, back against the wall, listening to it circle and scratch and growl. I didn't dare try to sleep, or even move much. Around 10 o'clock, after what felt like an eternity, the noises finally stopped. I waited another half hour before cautiously peeking through the curtains. The creature was gone. In the faint moonlight, I could see the deep scratches it had left on the door and window frames. I sank back onto my bed, shaking all over. There was no more denying it. Something truly abnormal was happening on this property. The strange eggs, the nightly barn noises, and now this thing pretending to be a dog. Grayson's rules weren't eccentric or paranoid. They were warnings. The morning after the dog thing incident, I felt the need to check the damage in daylight. I pulled on my boots and stepped outside, still jumpy and looking all around before fully committing to leaving the cabin. What I saw made my stomach drop. Deep gouges ran along the wooden door frame, splintering the timber in ways no normal dog could manage. These weren't just scratches. They looked like someone had taken a set of metal claws to the wood. 4 parallel lines, deep enough that I could fit my finger into the grooves. I walked around the cabin's perimeter, finding more marks on each window frame. The creature had systematically attacked every possible entrance. At the back of the cabin, I noticed something else in the dirt. Tracks. Not paw prints like I expected, but something that looked reptilian, with 3 long toes ending in what must have been claws. They reminded me of the dinosaur footprints I'd seen in museums, only smaller. I crouched down to examine them more closely. The tracks seemed to change as they circled the cabin, starting dog-like near the front door, but becoming these 3-toed marks around back. Whatever had visited wasn't just pretending to be a dog. It was physically transforming as it moved. I went back inside and tried to calm myself with coffee, but my hands shook as I poured water into the pot. The isolation of the ranch suddenly felt oppressive rather than peaceful. I kept glancing out the windows, expecting to see yellow eyes staring back at me. The sound of tires on the dirt road came as a relief. I recognized the rattle of Grayson's old pickup and hurried outside, eager for human contact after the previous night's terror. Grayson parked and climbed out, carrying a box of supplies. He took one look at my face and stopped. "You look like you've seen something," he said, his weathered face showing the first hint of concern I'd seen from him. "I did." I gestured toward the cabin. "Something came. It looked like a German shepherd at first, but it wasn't a dog." Grayson set down his box and walked over to examine the claw marks on the doorframe. He ran his fingers along the gouges, nodding to himself. "You followed the rule? Went inside right away?" "Yes, as soon as I remembered." "Good." He straightened up. "That's why you're still here." "What was it?" I asked, following him as he walked back to his truck. "It had rows of teeth, and its eyes. Things on this ranch aren't always what they appear to be," Grayson said, pulling another box from the truck bed. "That's why the rules matter." "But what was it?" I pressed. Grayson handed me the box. "You did right. That's all that matters." His tone made it clear the subject was closed. We unloaded the rest of the supplies in silence. Grayson checked the chicken coop, counted the eggs I'd collected, and inspected the fence repairs I'd managed to complete before the creature's appearance. He seemed satisfied with my work. Before leaving, he paused by his truck. "Keep following the rules, Mickey, all of them. The rules keep everyone safe." I wanted to ask who everyone included since I was alone on the property, but something in his expression stopped me. He knew more than he was saying, and he wasn't going to share it no matter how I asked. After Grayson left, the days fell into a routine. I collected eggs, fed chickens, avoided the barn after sunset, and tried to ignore the nightly noises. The creature that had posed as a dog didn't return, but I remained vigilant, checking for tracks each morning. By day 10, my mind kept circling back to the south fence. Of all Grayson's rules, that one nagged at me the most. Don't approach the barn after sunset. I understood that now, given the noises. Don't touch the scarecrow. It was creepy enough that I had no desire to get closer. Destroy extra eggs. After seeing the black substance, I followed that rule religiously. Go inside if you see a dog. That rule had saved my life. But the south fence? What could be so dangerous about a fence? The question gnawed at me until I couldn't stand it anymore. After finishing my morning chores, I found myself walking toward the aspen grove that separated the main property from the south fence. I told myself I was just going for a walk, but I knew where my feet were taking me. The aspens created a natural barrier, their white trunks and trembling leaves forming a curtain between sections of the property. As I moved deeper into the grove, the temperature seemed to drop. The cheerful rustling of leaves gave way to an unnatural quiet. I pushed through the last stand of trees and saw it, a chain-link fence topped with spirals of barbed wire. It stretched in both directions as far as I could see, cutting across the property like a scar. Beyond it lay what looked like an ordinary meadow filled with tall grass. But something felt wrong. The air around the fence seemed thicker, almost like walking into water. The grass on the other side had a sickly yellow tint. Nothing like the healthy green of the pastures near the main house, and there was a complete absence of wildlife. No birds flew overhead, no insects buzzed in the grass. I approached slowly, stopping about 10 feet from the fence. The meadow beyond should have been beautiful, but instead it felt wrong, oppressive, like the landscape itself was holding its breath. That's when I heard them. Whispers. So faint at first I thought it was just the wind, but there was no wind. The air was completely still. "Mickey." I froze. The voice was familiar, impossibly familiar. "Mickey, honey, is that you?" My grandmother, Virginia Stevenson, dead for 3 years. "Mickey, help us." Another voice joined in, this one masculine and just as recognizable. Parker Ramsey, my college roommate. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but I'd know his voice anywhere. "Mickey, man, you gotta help. Please." I took an involuntary step forward. How could they be here? It wasn't possible. "Grandma?" I whispered, my voice sounding strange in the heavy air. The whispers grew more urgent, overlapping each other. My grandmother begging me to help her. Parker saying something was hurting him. Other voices I couldn't quite identify joining the chorus. I stared into the yellow grass, trying to locate the source of the voices. That's when I saw it. Something dark moving within the grass, shifting and changing form. It seemed to flow rather than walk, a shadow that couldn't decide what shape to take. My hand reached for the fence of its own accord. I felt an overwhelming urge to climb over, to go to the voices, to help them somehow. My fingers touched the cold metal links. A sudden gust of icy wind hit me from behind, snapping me out of the trance. The rational part of my brain screamed danger, and I stumbled backward, away from the fence. The whispers grew angry, changing from pleas to threats. I turned and ran, crashing through the aspen grove, not stopping until I reached the cabin. I slammed the door behind me and leaned against it, breathing hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I suffered through my worst night yet at the ranch. The barn noises had been bad before, but tonight they escalated to deafening levels. What started as the usual moans and screams transformed into something more violent, splintering wood and scraping metal sounds that made me pull my pillow over my head and press it against my ears. It didn't help. The sounds cut through everything, making sleep impossible. I tossed and turned in bed, occasionally sitting up to peer through the darkness toward the barn, though I couldn't see anything through the blackness. Around 11, I noticed something new and terrifying. The whispers that had started at the south fence when I'd foolishly approached it days ago were no longer confined there. They seemed to be all around the cabin now. A circle of soft, urgent voices calling my name, pleading for help, making promises. I recognized my grandmother's voice among them, along with Parker's, but there were dozens of others too. Men, women, children, all speaking at once in an overlapping chorus that made my skin crawl. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, heart hammering in my chest. The voices knew things about me they shouldn't know, mentioning places I'd been, people I loved. They spoke directly to my fears and desires in ways that felt invasive, as if they were reading my thoughts. "Just until morning," I whispered to myself. "Just make it until morning." At midnight exactly, I noticed a shadow outside my window. At first I thought it might be the dog thing returning, but when I reluctantly looked, what I saw was much worse. The scarecrow stood directly outside my window. I froze in place, unable to even blink. The scarecrow, the same one I'd seen firmly planted in the north field earlier that day, now stood on my cabin's small patch of grass, its burlap head turned directly toward me. Even without eyes, I could feel it watching me through the glass. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The scarecrow didn't move either. We remained locked in this standoff for what felt like hours, though my phone told me it was only 20 minutes. The whispering voices continued their chorus around the cabin, occasionally rising in volume before fading again. Eventually, I backed away from the window, keeping my eyes on the scarecrow until I hit the opposite wall. I slid down to the floor and stayed there for the rest of the night, too terrified to look outside again, listening to the cacophony of barn noises and whispers until dawn finally broke. When the first light filtered through my window, the whispers faded. I waited another hour before finding the courage to look outside. The scarecrow was gone. I got dressed with shaking hands and forced myself to go about my morning chores. I needed to maintain some semblance of normalcy, and besides, Grayson would be coming today to take me back to town. My 2 weeks were finally up. I headed to the chicken coop first, basket in hand. When I stepped inside, I immediately knew something was wrong. The hens seemed agitated, clucking and pacing around their enclosure. I approached the nesting boxes with dread and counted the eggs. 23. I counted again, hoping I'd made a mistake. But the number remained the same. 23 eggs. 11 more than normal. 11 more than should be possible from this number of chickens. Following Grayson's second rule, I set aside 12 in my basket and prepared to destroy the extras. My hands trembled as I took the first excess egg and smashed it against the outer wall of the coop. Just like before, black substance oozed out instead of yolk and white. But this time, instead of simply seeping into the ground, the black liquid formed what looked like a symbol, lines and curves arranging themselves on the dirt before melting away. I broke the next one. Same result. Black goo forming a different symbol before disappearing. One by one, I smashed all 11 extra eggs. Each released the same black substance. Each formed a different symbol before melting away. I didn't recognize any of the shapes, but they looked deliberate, like letters in some ancient alphabet. After finishing this disturbing task, I walked toward the main house, planning to wait for Grayson there. As I passed the north field, I noticed the scarecrow had returned to its usual spot. But something was different. It wasn't in the same position as before. Its arms were angled differently and its head was tilted at a new angle. Most noticeably, its clothes looked newer, the flannel shirt brighter, the jeans less tattered. I was certain these weren't the same clothes it had been wearing yesterday. I hurried past, keeping my distance from the north field. About an hour later, Grayson's truck rumbled up the dirt road. I had my duffel bag packed and waiting on the cabin porch. "All set?" he asked as he got out of the truck. I nodded, eager to leave this place behind. "How were the last few days?" He looked at me with that same penetrating stare. I considered telling him about the south fence, about how I'd broken his rule and approached it, about the voices of my dead grandmother and college roommate, about the scarecrow appearing outside my window, about the 23 eggs and their strange symbols. But something held me back. Maybe fear that he'd withhold my payment, or worse. "Fine," I said. "Quiet." He studied my face for a moment. "Any interest in extending your stay? Could use the help around here." "No thanks," I said quickly. "I miss city life. Chicago's calling me back." Grayson nodded, seeming unsurprised by my answer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "Your wages," he said, handing it to me, "plus a little bonus for good work." I took the envelope and tucked it into my jacket without looking inside. "One more thing," Grayson added, his voice dropping lower. "What happens at this ranch stays at this ranch. Don't discuss it or its rules with anyone. Ever. For your own good." I swallowed hard and nodded. "I mean it," he continued. "Some things aren't meant to be understood or explained. Some boundaries exist for reasons beyond what most folks can comprehend." "I understand," I said, though I didn't. Not really. Grayson seemed satisfied with my response. He picked up my duffel bag and tossed it into the truck bed. "Let's get you back to town," he said. "You've got a bus to catch." I boarded the Greyhound bus back to Chicago, slumping into an empty window seat with a heaviness that had nothing to do with my duffel bag. The relief hit me as soon as Cedar Falls disappeared behind the pine-covered hills. My shoulders dropped, and I let out a breath I'd been holding for what felt like 2 weeks. The bus hummed beneath me, vibrating through my bones as we pulled onto the highway. Other passengers chatted or dozed around me, normal people with normal lives who hadn't seen what I'd seen. A woman across the aisle flipped through a magazine. An old man snored 3 rows up. None of them knew about barns that screamed at night or scarecrows that moved or things that weren't dogs. I patted my pocket, feeling the envelope Grayson had handed me before our silent drive to the bus station. He hadn't said much, just nodded when I thanked him for the ride. His weathered face had given away nothing, but his eyes had lingered on me a beat too long, like he was making sure I was really leaving. The envelope felt thick. I pulled it out and tore it open carefully, half expecting to find black goo inside. Instead, I counted out cash, twice what we'd agreed on for the 2 weeks of work. Tucked behind the bills was a folded piece of paper. I opened it to find a short note written in the same handwriting as the rules I'd memorized. Mickey, thank you for following the rules and keeping everyone safe. Grayson. I read it 3 times. Keeping everyone safe. Who was everyone? The town? Grayson himself? Or something else entirely? I thought about the voices at the fence, the thing that wasn't a dog, the barn noises. Were the rules keeping them contained or keeping them out? I folded the note and tucked it back into the envelope with the money. Some mysteries were better left unsolved. I'd done my job, gotten paid double, and was heading home in one piece. That was enough. The Montana landscape rolled past my window, beautiful and empty. I closed my eyes and tried not to think about yellow grass or black goo or the way the scarecrow had stood outside my window, watching. 3 days later, I walked into my Chicago apartment, dropped my bag, and stood in the middle of the room just listening to city sounds. Traffic honking, neighbors arguing, a siren wailing in the distance. Normal sounds, human sounds. I'd never appreciated them before. I went back to temping the following week, but I added a new rule to my job search. Nothing rural, nothing isolated. I turned down a weekend gig at a farm outside the city limits, even though it paid well. The account manager seemed surprised when I said no to easy money. Not your thing? She'd asked. Something like that, I'd answered. I never told anyone about Cedar Falls. Not my friends, not my family, not the therapist I started seeing for my sudden insomnia. What would I even say? I followed rules about eggs and scarecrows and things that weren't dogs. They'd think I was crazy. Maybe I was. Sometimes at night I'd wake up in a cold sweat, thinking I heard the low moaning from the barn or whispers calling my name. I'd sit up in bed, heart pounding, before realizing I was in Chicago, in my apartment, with neighbors on all sides and streetlights shining through my blinds. The sounds always faded, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined them or if they'd followed me home. Every few days, I checked the local news for Cedar Falls, Montana. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. Mysterious disappearances, strange animal sightings, a fire at an isolated ranch. But there was never anything. Just normal, small-town stuff. Fundraisers, school events, weather reports. Whatever was happening at Grayson's ranch stayed at Grayson's ranch. I kept his note in my wallet. Not for the money. I'd deposited that right away. But for the words. Thank you for following the rules and keeping everyone safe. It was a reminder that I'd encountered something beyond understanding and survived by doing exactly what I was told, no questions asked. The experience changed me. I used to push boundaries, ask questions, stick my nose where it didn't belong. Now I understood that some boundaries exist for good reasons, and some questions are better left unanswered. I'd walked to the south fence. I'd heard my dead grandmother's voice. I'd seen black goo form symbols in the dirt. And I'd learned my lesson.